You're mid-sentence when the atmosphere changes. It's almost invisible, just a slight tightening in someone's voice, a question that lingers a fraction longer than it should. Nothing dramatic, no open attack, yet your body registers it instantly. There's a pull to intervene, to straighten the angle of the conversation before it bends away from you. Your tongue prepares a defense your mind hasn't fully approved. Then, barely, you hesitate. That hesitation is small, but it's revealing. Because in that split second, you feel something most people never consciously examine, the fear of being defined by someone else's unfinished interpretation. And that fear doesn't feel minor, it feels urgent. Urgent enough to correct what wasn't clearly distorted, urgent enough to add context no one requested, urgent enough to fill space before silence gets a chance to speak for itself. Most people don't experience that as fear. They experience it as responsibility, as maturity, as good communication. But if it were only about clarity, why does it feel so personal? Why does it feel like something is being taken from you when you don't immediately respond? This reflex didn't form yesterday. It was built quietly over years. You learned early that misinterpretation carries consequences. A teacher misreads your tone and assumes disrespect. A friend twists your words and spreads a slightly altered version of events. A family member questions your intention in front of others. Each time, you adapt. You become sharper with your explanations. You preempt confusion before it can form. You anticipate objections before they're voiced. You refine your delivery until it's almost airtight. On the surface, this looks like growth. You become articulate, controlled, careful, but beneath that refinement, something else develops: predictability. People begin to understand how you operate under pressure. If they apply doubt, you clarify. If they challenge you publicly, you defend with precision. If they imply motive, you dissect it point by point. Not necessarily because they've earned that effort, but because tension inside you demands resolution, and resolution feels like regaining control. Here's what rarely gets acknowledged. Most confrontations are less about truth and more about leverage. When someone questions you in a group setting, it isn't always curiosity driving them. Sometimes it's calibration. They're measuring how quickly your composure shifts, how responsive you are to subtle pressure, whether a slight tonal adjustment can redirect your energy. And when you answer immediately, no matter how logical, no matter how composed, you disclose something invaluable. You show that your internal state is accessible, that it can be influenced in real time, that you're willing to enter performance mode the moment tension appears. Performance mode feels powerful in the moment. You assemble facts, reconstruct timelines, present your case with elegance. But while you're working to stabilize perception, the other person is studying your rhythm. Because they understand a principle you might not yet see, whoever dictates the tempo of an interaction shapes the frame of it. You might believe the objective is composure, but composure alone isn't immunity. You can maintain a steady tone while internally scrambling to repair an image you fear is slipping. You can appear measured while obsessively recalibrating how you're being perceived. The distinction isn't loud versus quiet, it's urgent versus anchored. Urgency betrays attachment. The need to correct every minor distortion, every subtle misreading becomes visible, even if your delivery is calm. People sense when something matters too much to you. And once they sense that, they instinctively identify where pressure is effective. Mention a sensitive topic and watch you elaborate. Introduce doubt and watch you prove. Slightly question your intent and watch you clarify in detail. It doesn't require malicious intent to recognize patterns. Humans are wired to notice what moves others, and when your movement is consistent, it becomes usable. Now consider a harder question. What if the real vulnerability isn't how others treat you, but how readable you've become? Automatic responses feel efficient. They feel responsible. But predictability reduces depth. When your reactions follow a familiar script, they lose weight. Expected behavior is easy to trigger, easy to anticipate, easy to guide. Someone doesn't need authority over you if they can forecast you. All they need is timing, a strategically placed comment, a carefully framed question, a public setting, and suddenly you're operating inside a pattern they've already mapped. The balance shifts subtly, not because you're weaker, because you're foreseeable, and foreseeability in high-stakes social environments is leverage. At this point, most people assume the correction is simple: speak less, withdraw, refuse engagement. But forced restraint is still reaction. It's the mirror image of impulsive explanation. You're still orienting your behavior around someone else's stimulus. You're just choosing the opposite response. That's why it often feels strained, artificial. There's tension in the silence. Real steadiness doesn't feel like suppression. It feels like non-urgency. The absence of internal panic when perception temporarily drifts outside your control. That absence is rare because we were conditioned to believe that reputation is fragile, that it requires constant supervision, that if you don't immediately correct the narrative, it will calcify against you. But reputations don't fracture from isolated misunderstandings. They fracture from inconsistency, and inconsistency often stems from overcorrection. When you rush to fix every perceived distortion, your responses fluctuate. One moment grounded, next moment defensive, one moment decisive, next moment over-detailed. That fluctuation plants more doubt than silence ever could. Ironically, the effort to appear transparent can make you seem unsettled, not because your reasoning lacks substance, but because your urgency signals attachment. And attachment, especially to how you are seen, can be sensed before it is spoken. Here's where the meaning quietly shifts. This dynamic isn't fundamentally about other people at all. It's about an internal reflex you've rarely questioned. The reflex that whispers, "Fix it immediately." The reflex that interprets delayed response as weakness. The reflex that treats temporary misinterpretation as permanent damage. Once you identify that reflex, you create distance from it. You can feel the spike of discomfort without converting it into action. You can allow a statement to exist in the room without rushing to reshape it. And in that restraint, not forced but chosen, the atmosphere changes. The other person continues. They elaborate. They repeat. They sometimes overextend. And in doing so, they reveal whether they sought understanding or control. Not everyone reacts well when the familiar pattern dissolves. Some will intensify. Their tone sharpens. Their questions become more pointed. They attempt to provoke clarity through escalation. But escalation in the absence of engagement exposes motive. If clarity was the goal, patience would suffice. If influence was the goal, urgency appears. The less you supply predictable emotional output, the more visible others' strategies become. Behavior that once blended into normal conversation starts to stand out. Patterns surface quickly when you're no longer busy defending yourself against every perceived threat. And this is the truth that unsettles most people. You will never fully control how you are perceived. There will always be interpretations forming in rooms you never enter, versions of you discussed in conversations you will never hear. Attempting to manage all of them is not only impossible, it is self-draining. The real evolution is not mastering when to speak. It is recognizing when the impulse to speak is born from insecurity rather than necessity. When you separate those two, your presence acquires weight. You respond by choice, not by pressure. You engage selectively, not reflexively, and that selectivity shifts dynamics without theatrics. So the next time you feel that familiar surge, the immediate urge to clarify, defend, or correct, pause long enough to interrogate the impulse itself. Not to strategize, not to manipulate, but to understand. Ask why silence feels threatening in that moment. Ask what you believe will be lost if you do not immediately respond. Because sometimes the compulsion to correct the narrative has little to do with truth. It has everything to do with protecting an identity that depends on instant validation. And the more your stability depends on being understood without delay, the more easily your behavior can be directed by those who recognize it.